The year is somewhere in the late 1800s, and you've just stepped off the rattling, soot-covered train into the heart of Victorian London. The air is thick not just with the cold, damp fog the city is famous for, but with a stubborn, choking haze from coal fires burning in countless chimneys. It smells of industry, of progress, and of something far less poetic: sewage, horse manure, and the ever-present tang of smoke. London is alive, crowded, restless, and overwhelming. The cobblestone streets pulse with activity. Gentlemen in tailored coats stride purposefully toward their clubs. Flower sellers call out in sing-song voices, chimney sweeps dart through alleyways, and omnibuses rumble past, their wheels spraying mud onto anyone unlucky enough to be standing too close. If you've come here to survive, the first lesson is simple: blend in. London is not kind to those who stand out. Your clothes must be practical enough to handle the city's grime, but respectable enough to avoid suspicion from the ever-watchful constables. And whatever you do, keep your pockets buttoned. Pickpockets here are as skilled as any banker, and a great deal faster. The city is a labyrinth of contrasts. One moment you're walking past grand gaslit shopfronts on Regent Street, the glass windows gleaming with displays of silks, perfumes, and imported teas. The next, UVA turned a corner and found yourself in a shadowy alley where the stench of rot hangs heavy, and narrow doorways hide pubs filled with men who desell your boots before you even finished your drink. Every breath feels like a gamble between awe and disgust. And yet, there's a strange pull to it, all this swirling mixture of wealth and filth, charm and danger. London in the Victorian age is a place where fortunes can change overnight, but so can your health, your safety, or your freedom. If you intend to make it here, you'll need more than luck. You'll need cunning, resilience, and a stomach strong enough to handle whatever the Thames decides to smell like that day. If you wish to last more than a week in Victorian London, you must master its unspoken laws, the kind no magistrate will ever write down, yet everyone on the streets obeys. Rule 1. Know where you stand in the invisible hierarchy. London is a city obsessed with class. The way you speak, the way you walk, even the way you hold your hat, tells others exactly where you belong. Speak too politely in the wrong district, and you'll be pegged as a pretentious outsider. Speak to roughly in polite company, and you'll be dismissed as a brute. The trick is to adjust your mannerisms like a chameleon, slipping between social worlds without anyone realizing. You are not truly part of either. Rule 2. Avoid dark alleys unless you know them better than the daylight streets. The narrow lanes of Whitechapel and the South Bank can swallow a man whole. Cut purses, gang lookouts, and opportunists lurk where gaslight fades into shadow. The police, they rarely arrive in time to help, and if they do, you might find yourself the one being questioned, especially if your accent or attire suggests you don't belong. Rule 3. Keep your money close and your wits closer. In the markets of Spitalfields or Billingsgate, every stallholder has a deal that sounds too good to be true, and it almost always is. Coins slip through fingers easily here, and a distracted mind is the fastest route to poverty. A true Londoner can bargain for a cut of meat with one hand while guarding their watch chain with the other. Rule 4. Learn the geography of danger. Certain pubs are safe havens, others are traps. Certain cab drivers will take you exactly where you ask, others will take you where they think they can earn more, either by overcharging or by delivering you to someone who pays better. And some neighborhoods, after nightfall, are best avoided entirely unless you have an urgent death wish. These rules won't guarantee your safety, but they will tilt the odds in your favor. In Victorian London, survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about being the most adaptable, the most watchful, and, when necessary, the most invisible. Because here, danger doesn't always announce itself with a knife or a shout. Sometimes it greets you with a handshake and a smile. In Victorian London, survival meant mastering the delicate art of keeping body and soul together on the slimmest of resources. For the working poor, every day began not with grand ambitions, but with the immediate and pressing question: what will I eat today? The answer depended on your luck, your trade, and sometimes the weather. If you had steady employment, a dock job, a factory shift, or domestic service, you could count on the bare minimum: a hunk of bread, perhaps a slice of cheese, and if fortune smiled, a pint of bitter to wash it down. But for casual laborers, match girls, and street hawkers, meals were unpredictable and often pieced together from scraps. The markets were both a blessing and a gamble. In Spitalfields, Covent Garden, or the great Billingsgate Fish Market, the smells could overwhelm: a heady mix of fresh produce, rotting fruit, smoked fish, and yesterday's refuse baking in the sun. If you knew the right stallholders, you might get a bruised apple for a penny or a stale loaf for half price. But hesitate too long and someone hungrier or quicker would snatch the bargain first. Street food was another lifeline. Hot eels in peppery liquor, baked potatoes steaming from coal-fired ovens, meat pies whose fillings were a mystery best left unexamined. These were the flavors of London's working streets. Vendors shouted their wares with voices honed by years of competition, each one claiming their fare was the cheapest, the freshest, the most filling. Beer wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. With water supplies often contaminated, ale or porter was the safer drink. Even children had small beer, weak in alcohol but free of the diseases lurking in the Thames. Gin, however, was another matter. Cheap, potent, and devastatingly addictive. It swallowed wages whole and left more than a few families without rent money or without a father. As for meat, the poor rarely saw it fresh. They bought cuts, others discarded awful bones, or whatever had begun to turn but could be salvaged with enough boiling. Soup kitchens and charitable missions filled the worst gaps, offering a ladle of broth and a chunk of bread in exchange for a prayer or a sermon. In this city, hunger was both a physical ache and a constant shadow. You learned to eat quickly, to waste nothing, and to take your chance whenever food was offered. Because in Victorian London, a full stomach was never guaranteed for tomorrow. If food was a daily struggle, finding somewhere to sleep in Victorian London was a nightly battle. The city's roofs, whether tiled, thatched, or leaking slate, were never evenly shared. Where you laid your head depended entirely on your purse, your luck, and sometimes, your willingness to risk danger for the sake of a dry corner. For the respectable working poor, there were the model dwellings or rented rooms in narrow terraces. But respectable was a generous term. Most of these rooms were crammed with entire families, sometimes 3 or 4 sharing a single bed. Privacy was a fantasy. The thin walls carried every cough, every argument, every whispered secret. Those with fewer coins to spare turned to the infamous lodging houses. For a few pennies, you might get a 4-penny coffin. Not a real coffin, but a wooden box bed just big enough to curl into, sometimes stacked in tiers like a grim bunkhouse. Cheaper still was the 2-penny hangover. A rope stretched across a room where the desperate could drape themselves forward and doze half standing. No blankets, no dignity, just enough rest to keep from collapsing in the street. Then there were the casual wards, part of the workhouse system. In theory, they offered free shelter to those in need. In practice, they were a place of last resort, cold, overcrowded, and steeped in shame. Entering meant surrendering your clothes, undergoing a scrub down, and sleeping on hard benches or straw pallets. For some, the streets themselves became the only option. Beneath railway arches, in doorways, under market stalls, after closing, London's homeless carved out niches wherever they could. Policemen might move them along, but the city's maze of alleys offered endless hiding spots from both the law and the night's predators. And yet, even in the most wretched conditions, people found ways to survive. They learned which lodging house keeper was least likely to steal from them, which church porch stayed dry in the rain, which market stalls left out the least spoiled scraps. Networks of mutual aid formed among the poorest, with an unspoken rule: tonight you share your corner, tomorrow someone else shares theirs. In Victorian London, a bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a lifeline, and every night, thousands gambled with coins, fate, and the mercy of strangers for the chance to close their eyes in relative safety. If London's streets looked filthy in the daylight, they were far worse than the eye could see. Beneath the layer of mud, manure, and discarded refuse lurked an invisible army: parasites, bacteria, and viruses that made every breath and every sip of water a gamble. The Thames, lifeblood of the city, doubled as its open sewer. Household waste, factory runoff, and human excrement poured into it daily. The river's surface shimmered with a sickly sheen, and in hot weather, the stench was so overpowering it could halt parliamentary sessions. Locals joked about the great stink, but the reality was no laughing matter. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread like wildfire through its waters. Water companies did little to help. Many simply pumped the same contaminated river water back into homes unfiltered, making every glass a potential death sentence. Boiling helped, but coal was expensive, and many could not afford the fuel for it. For the poor, thirst was often safer than drinking. The streets themselves bred their own dangers. Open gutters ran along the edges, carrying a foul soup of animal droppings, spoiled food, and chamber pot slop. In the crowded alleys, cesspits overflowed into living spaces, and the air reeked of ammonia and decay. In summer, swarms of flies multiplied, spreading disease with every landing. In winter, the filth froze into jagged, slippery ridges that could slice through thin boots. Diseases like smallpox, scarlet fever, and measles struck without mercy. Children were the most frequent victims, their immune systems no match for the constant barrage. Even a simple cut could turn septic, leading to fever, delirium, and death within days. For those with means, doctors were available, but medicine was still a dangerous science. Some cures involved mercury, arsenic, or bleeding. For the working poor, healthcare often meant relying on herbal remedies, prayer, and sheer endurance. And yet, amid this constant threat, life went on. Mothers scrubbed steps with carbolic soap, hoping to keep sickness at bay. Neighbors warned each other of outbreaks, and in a city where the dead cart rattled through the streets every morning, survival wasn't just about luck, it was about learning the subtle art of navigating a world where even the air could kill you. If the filth of London's streets didn't kill you, its shadows might. By day, petty thieves mingled with errant boys, their nimble fingers quick to relieve you of your pocket watch or coin purse. By night, entire neighborhoods transformed into hunting grounds for cutpurses, pickpockets, and burglars who knew every unlit alley and blind corner better than the city watch. The East End in particular was a warren of criminal enterprise. Here, fencers bought stolen goods, no questions asked. Pubs doubled as gang headquarters, and flash houses provided sanctuary for the city's most wanted. The notorious rookeries, densely packed slums, were so dangerous that even the police hesitated to enter without backup. In some streets, locals would throw bricks or boiling water from windows to drive officers away. Policing in Victorian London was still in its infancy. The Metropolitan Police had only been founded in 1829, and though their blue uniforms and truncheons were meant to project authority, they often lacked the manpower or the trust of the public to truly keep order. Corruption was rampant, and some constables were not above looking the other way for a coin or two. Gangs specialized in different trades of crime. The pickpocketing crews worked in coordinated trios, one to distract, one to lift the goods, and one to pass them off and vanish into the crowd. The smash-and-grab men favored speed and brute force, shattering shop windows and fleeing before anyone could react. The con artists operated with words sharper than any knife, promising fortunes through bogus investments or fake lotteries. For women, survival in this criminal underworld often meant walking a fine line between victim and accomplice. Some turned to prostitution, not out of desire, but because it was the only way to earn enough to eat. Others worked as bludgers, luring wealthy men into secluded spots where accomplices could rob them. Even honest citizens weren't safe from the law itself. The debtor's prison loomed as a constant threat, ready to swallow anyone who fell behind on rent or owed money to the wrong person. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible without payment, and many never emerged alive. And yet, crime in Victorian London wasn't always desperation, it was often opportunity. In a city where the gulf between rich and poor was a canyon, some saw theft not as sin, but as survival. In Victorian London, survival wasn't just about avoiding disease, hunger, or the knife in a dark alley. It was about developing a sixth sense for danger, opportunity, and deception. People learned to read faces the way others might read books, catching the twitch of a liar's eye or the telltale tightening of a hand about to strike. Children born into the rookeries developed this skill young. By the age of 6, a street child could tell which shopkeepers were soft-hearted enough to offer bread, and which would chase them with a broom. They could judge the weight of a coin purse by the way it swung in a gentleman's coat pocket. Trust was currency, but it was spent carefully, often only on blood relatives, and even then, not always. The poor developed a network of quiet alliances. The baker who would sell day-old bread for a penny, the seamstress who mended coats for food instead of coin, the pub landlord who kept a back door open for a quick escape from the police. These were lifelines in a city where charity was sparse and the workhouse loomed like a vulture, ready to pick apart the dignity of the desperate. Appearance was as much a tool as any weapon. A quick polish of the boots and a clean collar could mean the difference between being treated as a respectable worker or being shoved aside as a beggar. Some criminals even used this to their advantage, dressing as gentlemen to gain access to places where no thief should tread. The middle and upper classes, too, lived with their own brand of vigilance. Locks were checked twice before bed, silver polished but counted, and servants subtly monitored to ensure they weren't slipping a little extra from the pantry or the till. In a city where the gap between wealth and poverty was a chasm, suspicion ran in both directions. Ultimately, survival in Victorian London was about adaptation. You didn't just live in the city, you negotiated with it. day by day, transaction by transaction, and those who couldn't adapt became part of the city's anonymous statistics, lost to the fog and the filth. When the gas lamps flickered to life and the last orange traces of daylight bled into the fog, Victorian London underwent its nightly transformation. The respectable streets, lined with townhouses and tidy shopfronts, grew quiet while the city's underbelly stretched awake and began to breathe. Music halls blazed with light and laughter. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, beer, and the sweet perfume of dancers. Patrons crowded into the wooden benches, their eyes fixed on the stage where singers belted bawdy tunes and comedians delivered quick-witted jabs about politics, marriage, and the endless miseries of London life. These performances weren't merely entertainment, they were relief, a temporary escape from the grind of survival. In the narrow alleys behind the venues, a different kind of business took place. Gamblers hunched over dice in back rooms, card games dragged on until dawn, and money changed hands faster than the lamplight could catch the glint of a coin. Some walked away richer, most did not. Down by the docks, the taverns swelled with sailors, laborers, and opportunists. Rum flowed as freely as the lies, and fights could erupt over something as small as a spilled drink or a misplaced glance. The savvy drinker knew to keep his back to the wall, his hat low, and one hand always near his pocket. And then there were the streets, where the gaslight barely reached, where the sound of footsteps behind you could mean a shadow was drawing closer. Not every predator in Victorian London carried a knife. Some wore fine clothes, spoke with charm, and invited you into ruin with a smile. For some, the night was a time of danger. For others, it was when they truly lived. The city's poorest scavenged its refuse, thieves prowled for opportunity, and lovers met in the stolen privacy of the fog. In Victorian London, night didn't simply fall, it claimed, and those who wished to see the morning had to learn its rules, its rhythms, and its dangers. In Victorian London, survival wasn't just about avoiding hunger or disease, it was about navigating the labyrinth of unspoken rules that governed every interaction. Break them, and you risked more than embarrassment. You could ruin your reputation, lose your livelihood, or even find yourself shunned from entire districts. For the working poor, these rules were unwritten but brutally enforced. If you owed a favor, you repaid it quickly, or you would find doors closing in your face. If you worked a trade, you never stole another man's customer unless you were prepared to defend yourself with fists or worse. And if you were smart, you learned to tip the right people, doormen, messengers, dockhands, because, in London, information could be more valuable than gold. For the middle and upper classes, the rules were more polished but no less strict. A gentleman never called upon a lady without a formal introduction. A lady never walked unaccompanied unless she wanted her name whispered in drawing rooms. Invitations to dinner or the theater had to be answered promptly. Delay was seen as an insult. And in all cases, appearances were everything. A frayed cuff or an unpolished boot could brand you careless, while a well-timed compliment might open doors money could not. Then there were the rules of the street shared by everyone, regardless of class. You didn't stare too long at strangers, you kept your purse close in crowded markets, and if you saw a crowd gathering suddenly, you moved in the opposite direction. A brawl, a pickpocket's distraction, or worse, could be unfolding. But perhaps the most important rule of all was simple: know your place. In a city where class boundaries were as rigid as the bricks of its row houses, stepping above or below your station could make you a target. These invisible laws weren't written in any book, but every Londoner carried them in their bones. They were as much a part of the city as the fog that rolled off the Thames. And if you wished to endure here, you followed them not out of fear, but because in London, survival itself was a kind of performance. To walk through Victorian London by day was to step into a living, breathing machine, one powered by muscle, hooves, steam, and sheer human will. The streets were never silent, never still. Wheels clattered over cobblestones, horses snorted clouds of breath into the cold air, and the shouts of street sellers rose and fell like the tide. Omnibuses, heavy with passengers, lumbered down the main thoroughfares, their wheels throwing up sprays of muddy water. Cabbies cracked their whips, weaving between delivery carts and drays laden with barrels. The bolder pedestrians darted between traffic, the cautious ones hugged the edges, where the footpaths offered a thin measure of safety though puddles, refuse, and the occasional runaway goat could still ruin your day. Markets pulsed with a rhythm of their own. At Covent Garden, the air smelled of flowers, crushed leaves, and ripe fruit. At Billingsgate, it was fish fresh, salted, smoked, and sometimes far too close to rotten. Spitalfields was a chorus of barter, the clink of scales, and the slap of coins into calloused hands. Every sense was engaged. The color of exotic fabrics, the hiss of roasting chestnuts, the warm steam from a horse's flank as you pressed through the crowd. For the unprepared, the city's pace was overwhelming. A single careless step could land you face first in a dung heap or pressed against a wall by a cart driver in too much of a hurry to care. Pickpockets used the crush of bodies as cover, vanishing into the flow before you even noticed your purse was gone. And yet, this chaos was also the city's lifeblood. It was in the markets, the crowded crossings, the endless press of humanity that fortunes were made, rumors spread, and the heartbeat of London could be felt most strongly. To survive it, you didn't just move through the streets, you learned to move with them, flowing like water around obstacles, keeping one eye ahead and the other on your pockets. Not all of Victorian London was toil and grime. For those with a few pennies to spare or the good fortune to steal a free afternoon, the city offered diversions that glittered against the backdrop of soot and fog. Parks were the lungs of the capital. Hyde Park, Regent's Park, and Kensington Gardens drew strollers from every class, though each group tended to keep to its own section. Here, children flew kites, couples promenaded arm in arm, and orators in places like Speaker's Corner aired their opinions to anyone willing to listen or heckle. In summer, the air was filled with the scent of grass, and the sound of brass bands playing jaunty marches. Fairs and street performances brought bursts of color to otherwise gray neighborhoods. Jugglers, fire eaters, and acrobats drew tight circles of spectators, their laughter mingling with the cries of vendors selling hot chestnuts and sticky toffee apples. In some districts, these gatherings bordered on chaos, with pickpockets working as tirelessly as the entertainers. For those seeking grandeur, the city's museums and galleries beckoned. The British Museum offered free entry, granting visitors a chance to see mummies, marble statues, and artifacts from lands most could only dream about. At the Crystal Palace, an enormous marvel of glass and iron, visitors wandered through exhibitions that celebrated industry, science, and the strange wonders of the natural world. The zoological gardens in Regent's Park promised a glimpse at lions, elephants, and exotic birds, their cries echoing oddly against the city's din. For many Londoners, it was the closest they would ever come to foreign adventure. But entertainment was not always polite. Prize fights drew crowds to hidden yards and backrooms, while cockfighting and rat-baiting lured gamblers into grim, smoky cellars. Even these illicit spectacles had their regulars, forming communities of their own beneath the city's respectable veneer. In the daylight, London showed a softer face. But even here, survival instincts remained sharp, because whether you were admiring Egyptian relics or feeding ducks by the Serpentine, someone's eyes were always on your purse. Step away from the roar of London's streets, close the door behind you, and the city changes. Inside the walls of a home, be it a grand townhouse in Belgravia or a single rented room in the East End, life moved to a different rhythm, shaped by class, tradition, and the never-ending battle against dirt and disorder. For the wealthy, the household ran like a small army, commanded by a matriarch or butler and staffed with layers of servants, cooks, maids, footmen, nursemaids, and coachmen. Meals arrived on polished silver, linens were laundered to snowy perfection, and floors gleamed from constant polishing. Yet even in luxury, privacy was rare. Servants moved silently through corridors, and family life unfolded within a web of etiquette and duty. The middle class aspired to this order, though on a smaller scale. Clerks, shopkeepers, and teachers might employ a single maid all work often, a young girl from the countryside who rose before dawn and labored until long after dark. The rest of the household pitched in with chores, from beating rugs in the yard to hauling coal scuttles up narrow stairs. For the working poor, domestic life was survival stripped bare. Entire families might occupy one damp room, their belongings crammed into trunks or hung on nails along the wall. Meals were cooked over small grates or shared stoves in crowded tenements. Water had to be carried from pumps, and the weekly laundry was a back-breaking affair, scrubbing clothes by hand, boiling them over open fires, then hanging them to dry in the ever-present soot. Children's lives mirrored their parents. In wealthier homes, they were dressed in miniature versions of adult fashions and educated by In poorer households, they became breadwinners as soon as they could work selling matches, sweeping chimneys, or minding younger siblings while parents labored. Evenings were shaped by light and fuel. The rich could afford gas lamps or candles in every room. The poor relied on a single tallow candle, its weak flame shared by the entire household. In winter, the hearth was the heart of the home if there was coal to burn. No matter the class, the home was both a refuge and a reflection of one's place in society. For some, it was a fortress against the chaos outside. For others, it was just another battleground in the daily fight to endure. Even in a city weighed down by coal smoke and hardship, the Victorian calendar was dotted with moments of color and joy, occasions when Londoners, rich and poor alike, paused their struggles to mark the passage of time with music, food, and light. Christmas reigned supreme. Long before Dickens put pen to paper, the season was celebrated with greenery, feasting, and games. But the Victorians elevated it to a glittering spectacle. Homes were adorned with holly, ivy, and thanks to Queen Victoria's German husband, Prince Albert, the Christmas tree. In wealthier homes, tables groaned under the weight of roast goose or beef, mince pies, plum pudding, and jugs of hot punch. For the poor, charitable societies and churches distributed food, coal, and small gifts, bringing at least a taste of festivity to those who could not afford it. Carol singers roamed the streets, their breath puffing in the frosty air, trading song for coins. May Day brought a burst of spring color. In certain districts, children danced around maypoles, ribbons fluttering, while costumed May Queens were crowned with flowers. Street performers and market fairs made the day as much about commerce as merriment, and in working-class neighborhoods, it was often an excuse for boisterous drinking. Public holidays like Queen Victoria's birthday, royal jubilees, or military victories saw the streets lined with flags and the night skies lit with fireworks. Parades filled the main thoroughfares with brass bands leading processions of soldiers, dignitaries, and community groups. For those without the means to travel far, these events were a rare chance to join the city's grand pageantry. Autumn brought harvest festivals, particularly in rural-leaning suburbs and church communities. Churches were decorated with sheaves of wheat, pumpkins, apples, and flowers, celebrating the bounty of the year and distributing food to the needy. Even smaller traditions flourished. Twelfth Night cakes, Shrove Tuesday pancakes, Guy Fawkes bonfires crackling with danger and excitement. Each celebration carried its own scents, sounds, and customs, blending ancient rituals with the modern city's restless energy. For many, these holidays weren't just diversions, they were lifelines, bright markers in the long, hard road of the year. In a city that could grind down even the strongest, moments of shared festivity were reminders that life still held warmth, music, and wonder. In a London of gaslight and shadow, where death walked as freely as the living, superstition clung to the city like fog. For many Victorians, belief in unseen forces was not a quaint relic of the past, it was woven into daily life. Death, in particular, had its own set of rituals and warnings. Mirrors were covered after a passing, lest the soul of the deceased become trapped inside. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death to prevent bad luck from settling on the household. Some families placed coins over the eyes of the dead, a practice said to keep spirits from wandering or to pay the ferryman in the next life. Omens were taken seriously. A raven tapping at a window meant misfortune was near. Dropping a knife could mean an unexpected visitor. Seeing a hearse with no horses was a sure sign of an impending death. Even the ringing of church bells in certain patterns was enough to make an entire street fall silent. The rise of spiritualism in the mid-19th century brought in spirit photography into fashionable drawing rooms. Mediums claimed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, summoning loved ones with table rapping, mysterious knocks, or ghostly ectoplasm. While skeptics scoffed, even prominent figures attended these gatherings, half curious, half hopeful. Fortune-tellers plied their trade in markets and back alleys, offering palm readings, tarot cards, or tea leaf interpretations. For a coin, they promised to reveal love, wealth, or warning. The desperate sometimes clung to these predictions like lifelines, while others treated them as mere diversion. Protective charms were common among the working poor. A sprig of rohan pinned inside a coat, a horseshoe above the door, or a coin carried from birth were thought to ward off ill luck. Sailors carried talismans to ensure safe passage. Factory workers kept small tokens to protect against injury. In a city of stark contrasts, scientific progress on one hand, grinding uncertainty on the other, superstition offered a sense of control. Whether in the smoky parlor of a spiritualist or the cramped kitchen of a tenement, belief in the unseen was a reminder that London's true mysteries weren't always in its streets, but in the spaces between life and death. For all its soot, squalor, and superstition, Victorian London was also a city surging toward the future. Inventions and engineering feats reshaped daily life at a pace that left some in awe, and others in fear that the world was moving too quickly. The railways were perhaps the most visible symbol of this transformation. Great stations like King's Cross and Paddington loomed like cathedrals of iron and glass, swallowing crowds and spitting them out across the country. Trains brought goods, workers, and visitors into the capital in numbers unimaginable a generation earlier. For the first time, ordinary people could travel to the seaside for a day or visit relatives far away, shrinking the country in ways that felt almost magical beneath the streets. The London Underground, the world's first subway, began to thread its way through the city. The early steam-powered carriages were hot, noisy, and choked with smoke, but they spared passengers the chaos of the surface traffic. Some hailed it as the future. Others swore they'd never ride in a hole under the earth. Gas lighting spread through streets and homes, pushing back the night. Shop windows glowed well after sunset, and factories hummed longer into the evening. Yet gas was expensive, and the poor still relied on tallow candles or rushlights. The wealthy marveled at the prospect of electricity, though in the 1800s it was still a curiosity more than a necessity. The printing press grew faster and cheaper, flooding the streets with newspapers, serialized novels, and penny dreadfuls, thrilling tales of crime and horror that children devoured in secret. The telegraph allowed news to travel across continents in minutes rather than weeks, changing the rhythm of politics, business, and war reporting. Industry marched forward with steam-powered factories, mechanized looms, and advances in steel production. These innovations fed the city's appetite for goods, but also filled the air with soot and the rivers with waste. Even the mundane changed. Sewing machines quickened the work of dressmakers. Flush toilets appeared in wealthier homes, and postal deliveries became so frequent that lovers and businessmen alike could exchange multiple letters in a single day. For some, these advances were a promise of a better life. For others, they were a sign that the old world was vanishing too fast, replaced by machines, noise, and an ever-growing city that seemed to swallow both the past and the countryside whole. Victorian London was a paradox, both a crucible and a cradle. It could strip a person to their barest instincts or sharpen them into something stronger than they ever imagined. In its streets, fortunes rose and fell in the space of a heartbeat. In its alleys, lives ended before they had truly begun. Victorian London was a paradox, both a crucible and a cradle. It could strip a person to their barest instincts or sharpen them into something stronger than they ever imagined. In its streets, fortunes rose and fell in the space of a heartbeat. In its alleys, lives ended before they had truly begun. Here, progress clanged on iron rails while superstition whispered in candlelit rooms. The poor and the powerful walked the same fog-bound avenues, separated by little more than money, manners, and the fragile illusion of safety. The city's air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, roasting chestnuts, damp stone, and human ambition. To survive here was not simply to endure hunger, disease, or danger. It was to learn the city's language. Its vocabulary was written in glances, bargains, and the quiet exchange of favors. Its grammar lay in knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to vanish into the crowd. Some left the city broken, their names swallowed by the workhouse ledgers or carved into weather-worn stones in overcrowded churchyards. Others thrived, climbing ladders of commerce, politics, or art, building fortunes and legacies in a place that seemed determined to test them at every step. And yet, for all its cruelty, London had a way of holding on to those who had walked its streets. The clatter of wheels on cobblestones, the shimmer of gaslight in the fog, the chorus of cries from market stalls, these lingered in memory like the refrain of a song you could never quite forget. Victorian London did not promise safety or comfort. What it offered, instead, was a stage. And on that stage, every man, woman, and child played their part, whether they wished to or not, in the grand, grim, and glorious performance of the city. Here, progress clanged on iron rails while superstition whispered in candlelit rooms. The poor and the powerful walked the same fog-bound avenues, separated by little more than money, manners, and the fragile illusion of safety. The city's air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, roasting chestnuts, damp stone, and human ambition. To survive here was not simply to endure hunger, disease, or danger. It was to learn the city's language. Its vocabulary was written in glances, bargains, and the quiet exchange of favors. Its grammar lay in knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to vanish into the crowd. Some left the city broken, their names swallowed by the workhouse ledgers or carved into weather-worn stones in overcrowded churchyards. Others thrived, climbing ladders of commerce, politics, or art, building fortunes and legacies in a place that seemed determined to test them at every step. And yet, for all its cruelty, London had a way of holding on to those who had walked its streets. The clatter of wheels on cobblestones, the shimmer of gaslight in the fog, the chorus of cries from market stalls, these lingered in memory like the refrain of a song you could never quite forget. Victorian London did not promise safety or comfort. What it offered instead was a stage, and on that stage, every man, woman, and child played their part whether they wished to or not in the grand, grim, and glorious performance of the city.